Welcome to Tardisian Files. Hello, listeners. Well, that's it. That is a wrap on Doctor Who 2024 Season 1. Therefore, it's time for a full review of the first season of this new era of Doctor Who. Let's jump right in, starting with the episode rankings. In last place, we understandably have Space Babies. This episode, while it was sweet and quirky in its own right, it was almost certainly written for children and ultimately was very light in terms of what you'd expect from the first episode of a Doctor Who series. And on top of that, the villain was very weak, and even though there was a very simple solution at the end of the story, there's no denying that this episode was definitely the weakest one. Next up, we have Boom. A very tense episode with a very interesting take on war and how capitalism can negatively contribute to modern conflict. This story could have taken place anywhere, and so I feel like for an episode taking place in a war zone, it should have explored the setting a little bit more. This episode very much felt like they took the first few moments of Genesis of the Daleks, which Stephen Moffat did confirm was the inspiration for the entire episode, but I feel like he took that idea and thought, how much of a story can we squeeze out of this first few moments? The answer is a whole episode, just not a very strong one. Next up, we have The Devil's Cord. Now we're getting on the right track. This episode had a very fun, camp, very amusing, threatening villain in the form of the Maestro, and it had a fairly compelling storyline. I did think that the inclusion of the Beatles was highly unnecessary for this episode, as it didn't really have much of an impact on the story until the very end, and even though we now know that this episode was full of hints to foreshadow Sutek's arrival, and to make us think that Susan Triad was Susan Foreman, upon re-watching this episode, you can kind of see which elements that the episode can take or leave without it really impacting the story. Also, the whole Ruby's hidden song thing still hasn't really been fully explained, and it feels like something that Russell T Davies threw into the script while he was still deciding who the big bad would be and how it would interact with Ruby's storyline. And I feel like so this episode was sort of a mixed bag of what was really, really good and what was kind of random and felt a bit disjointed from the rest of the series. Next up, we have Dot and Bubble. Doctor Who meets Black Mirror. This episode was unnerving for the most part and definitely hit the dystopian chord it was intended to strike for the most part. Lindy and her friends were the protagonists that we all love to hate, and the shocking twist of their racist views at the end of the episode made them all the more unlikable. I feel like the plot of the episode was definitely written to be more of a misanthropic cautionary tale, and it certainly delivered that with the Doctor relearning one of the harshest lessons in the universe. Some people just cannot get over their bigotry, even if it's to save their own lives. Also, the fact that the episode didn't really have any good guys is a kind of storyline that does not often get explored in Doctor Who, but with a combination of the Dot's murderous rampage, the Man-Trap's mindless massacre, and the Fine Time inhabitants' inexcusable actions and opinions, left the audience wondering who was right amongst all of this. My opinion, none of them. They're all as bad as each other. On the next level up on this ranking list, we have Rogue, another themed episode where Doctor Who meets Bridgerton. Though the Choulders themselves weren't particularly threatening, they were clearly written for comedy rather than scare, and they were very well written and portrayed by the actors very well for that purpose. The Doctor and Rogue's short-lived romance, while a little bit fast, was, in my opinion, a very refreshing subplot for the Doctor, as it shows that he has healed a lot from the loss of people like River Song, and has become a lot less jaded when it comes to love. Jonathan Groff's performance was also wonderfully done, as he plays the brooding anti-hero type so well. And finally, the setting. The whole alien attack theme at the Bridgerton Ball was a combination that shouldn't work well, but it absolutely does, and it made this episode a joy to watch. On the next level up, we have 73 Yards. Surprisingly, the Dr. Light episode of this series was one of the more impactful episodes. Not only was the woman who haunted Ruby a very eerie element of the episode, but the episode focused very heavily on the theme of isolation and abandonment, and most importantly, Ruby rising above it all, which was very powerful, I thought, and especially relatable for many people post the COVID-19 lockdowns. Additionally, the political aspect of this episode certainly gave the episode a much more real-world feel to it, and it was very obvious due to the timing of this episode that it was written to deliberately play on the feelings of political anxiety that many people would have been feeling in the run-up to the UK election, which saw the Conservative Party lose power after what was arguably their most turbulent and divisive period in office. In second place, we have The Empire of Death. The reason I put it as second rather than first is because even though the episode starts off really powerful with the Doctor only narrowly escaping Sutekh as he wipes out every single planet in every moment of history, cutting the Doctor off from UNIT and anyone else who might have been able to have helped him, the end of the episode with Ruby's birth mother being revealed to just be a regular woman with a backstory very similar to many other young mothers that had just been very inexplicably dramatically portrayed in all the flashbacks, made this episode feel a bit disjointed from the rest of the Ruby subplot. Additionally, Sutekh's defeat. Being dragged through the vortex on a lead also felt very rushed and anticlimactic, hence why this episode only made it to second place on this ranking list. And so in first place, that leaves The Legend of Ruby Sunday. As a standalone episode from its second part, this episode had everything, from all the foreshadowing one could hope for from a penultimate episode to the jaw-dropping ending revealing Sutekh's return after many decades have passed since his first appearance was absolutely incredible. The episode did very well to develop Ruby's mystery and had many tender moments, such as the Doctor opening up to Kate about why he never visited Susan after leaving her in 2163 on Earth. The time window also served as a great plot device to get around the established time travel rules of the Doctor and Ruby crossing their own time streams, and it also served as a very amusing moment for the Doctor to laugh at UNIT for building something he explicitly forbade them from building, even though he knew that they were going to do it in spite of him anyway. Overall, this episode was absolutely incredible, and therefore it takes the number one place on my ranking of the episodes for this series. Next up, we have the villain rankings. So, again, at the bottom, no surprise, is the Boogeyman. He wasn't even a real villain per se, just an imaginary friend with a bit of a weird and gross origin story. I don't really have much to say on the villain. It definitely fit in with the theme of the episode, but it just wasn't very threatening or overly amusing either. Next, we have the Chouldar. These comedic and sinister villains loved drama, and they certainly provided a strange but interesting contrast to the Regency era setting of the episode. That said, they weren't the brightest of villains, and they were ultimately very easily trapped and defeated, despite their arguably formidable body-snatching abilities. Next on the podium, we have potentially one of the most hated one-episode characters of the show. You guessed it, it's Lindy Pepperbean. Though she is the main protagonist of her episode, it became very clear throughout the episode, and especially at the end of Dot and Bubble, that she was arguably just as bad as the main villains themselves. A childish, selfish brat with tunnel vision when it comes to life in general, she was clever enough to weaponise the Dot algorithm to save herself, sacrificing Ricky September to escape the Dot. And in the end, her selfishness and bigotry were her own undoing, as she and the rest of the racist inhabitants of Fine Time sailed off into the wilderness to their certain doom, rather than let themselves be saved by the Doctor just because he was black. Therefore making Lindy's character cross the boundary from unlikable to just downright hateful. One up from Lindy are the man-traps and the Dots, only just surpassing the inhabitants of Fine Time by a very thin margin on this list. This unlikely coalition consisted of hateful sentient smartphones with the ability to wipe out 2 whole worlds undetected, and utterly horrifying mindless predators with the ability to swallow their prey in one bite, and being granted the ability to move about freely by the Dot's hold over the Fine Time citizens, keeping them completely distracted and deliberately directing them to walk head-on into the jaws of the man-traps. Overall, when you think about it, the Dots and the man-traps were a very terrifying combination. Next up, Villain Guard. This company, mostly represented through its technology, can be considered in the same vein as the Dots. The technology was used to subjugate whole star systems by creating fictional wars for clients to fight in order to keep them buying weapons, embodying the negative and inhumane impact that capitalism can have on modern warfare and conflict. Next on our list is Roger Ap Gwilliam, the most dangerous Prime Minister ever. And when you pay attention to the political details of 73 Yards, you can see that that is represented perfectly throughout the episode. While he puts on the facade of being an understanding and progressive leader, it was very obvious from the get-go that he was neither, putting in place policies that infringed upon people's freedoms and rights, and threatening to isolate the UK from the international community in a way that almost led to nuclear war in the original timeline. His character was almost certainly an allusion to certain real-life politicians, which only made him all the more threatening and unlikable, especially for UK audiences. Thank God he didn't get an extra term, eh? Can you imagine if he'd have been in charge during the 2049 moon crisis? He probably wouldn't have thought twice before launching his private little stash of nukes that he purchased from Pakistan to kill the moon immediately, and probably would have made things worse in the process. Next up, we have the Woman, or the Spectre as I referred to her in the episode review. This one struck an emotional chord with me personally, since the Spectre pushed Ruby into an alternate timeline and effectively ruled her life, cutting her off from the Doctor, her family, and UNIT, all for reading a scroll. Bit of an overreaction. Even though this villain ultimately helped Ruby save the day, she still wasn't rid of her after the Spectre had done her job. Ruby had to wait her entire life before being given the ability to go back and negate the timeline by stopping her younger self from reading the scroll that set her free in the first place, therefore earning this villain a nice little spot on this ranking list. In second place, we have Notation Maestro. The Maestro was one of the rare villains who had the Doctor well and truly beaten, and in an alternate timeline brought about nuclear Armageddon. A powerful music-consuming deity with an inferiority complex with the Toymaker, this villain was a joy and a horror to behold. That leaves Sutekh in first place on our ranking list. This one is a bit of a no-brainer, but it definitely is a level up from the Maestro. Sutekh had the Doctor well and truly beaten as well, and not only did he kill Earth, but he killed the entire universe over and over again in every moment that the TARDIS had landed. Though his defeat was a little underwhelming, the whole concept of him clinging to the TARDIS the whole time, evolving and playing a long game by implanting his Susan Triad duplicates everywhere the Doctor landed, really was an epic plot twist, and it certainly did the character concept behind Sutekh justice by elevating him to true god status. And there you go, folks. That's my take on Doctor Who Season 1 2024 in the form of episode rankings and villain rankings. What did you guys make of the episodes and the villains of this season? Would you rank them differently? Let us know on our social media pages, and if you're listening on our brand new YouTube channel, please put it in the comment section down below. And as always, see you next time on Tardisian Files.